What would happen when a battle-hardened Special Forces soldier, a man who had survived explosions and gunfire, who carried on his shoulder the most elite insignia in the United States Army, publicly mocked a 92-year-old man right in the middle of a military base? And what if I told you that the frail older man had once done something an entire generation of soldiers would later inherit with honor? In just a few short minutes, an entire noisy dining hall would fall silent. A four-star general would raise his hand in salute, and a Green Beret would be forced to learn the greatest lesson of his life. Don't look away from this story, because sometimes the person who appears the weakest in the room is the one carrying the heaviest history on his shoulders. Noon at Fort Bragg always had its own rhythm. Metal trays clattered against one another. The scent of grilled meat and hot coffee hung in the air. Groups of young soldiers laughed loudly, boasting about the morning's training, their most recent parachute jump, the deployments they proudly recounted like personal victories. Amid that charged atmosphere, Staff Sergeant Ryan Caldwell walked in, 32 years old, a Green Beret. The insignia on his shoulder was one not everyone was entitled to wear. Solid build, confident stride, eyes that always looked straight ahead. He was the kind of man who made younger soldiers fall quiet as he passed, not out of fear but admiration. Ryan and his team entered the dining hall like a familiar formation. Their laughter was louder than that of the other tables, not rude, but noticeable. Here, they were the symbol of strength, of the present, of modern warfare. And then Ryan saw him. In the corner of the room near the window, an older man sat alone. A brown jacket, worn thin at the shoulders. An old baseball cap embroidered with small words, Korea Veteran. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted his cup of water, yet his eyes were calm, as though he did not belong to the noise around him. The contrast made Ryan pause. Among hardened muscles and bright insignia, the image of a 92-year-old man quietly eating lunch looked almost out of place. Ryan tilted his head, a half-playful, half-mocking smile forming. "Sir, what unit were you in? Infantry from the Civil War?" Laughter broke out from his group, not especially malicious, just a joke, a familiar tease from young men who believed they stood at the peak. But the older man did not laugh. He did not react. He simply continued eating, slowly, as if the comment had never existed. It was that silence that began to change the air. A few forks froze mid-air. A glance flickered over, then quickly away. The laughter faded, not because anyone ordered it to, but because of instinct. Ryan stepped one pace closer to the older man's table. His confidence was still there, but in that room, something very subtle had begun to shift. Ryan did not stop at a single joke. Perhaps it was the older man's silence that struck his ego more deeply than any protest ever could. He set his tray down on the table across from him and pulled out a chair, sitting without being invited. Two teammates stood behind him, forming an invisible perimeter around the small table where the older man sat. "This is an active military base, sir," Ryan said, his voice no longer playful. "Do you have authorization to be here?" The older man did not look up. He lifted his spoon to his mouth, chewing slowly, deliberately, as though every movement had been carefully measured. That composure did not resemble the awkwardness of someone caught off guard. It resembled the calm of someone who had lived through far greater things. Ryan leaned forward, his large hand pressed against the edge of the table, knuckles prominent. "I'm talking to you." The air around them grew heavier. Conversations at nearby tables softened, then stopped entirely. No one stared directly, but everyone knew what was unfolding. Ryan's gaze suddenly caught on the lapel of the older man's jacket. A small metal insignia, worn with age, two crossed swords, and a lightning bolt, dulled by time. It was not polished, not ornate, but it was pinned carefully and precisely. Ryan let out a faint chuckle. That thing? Pick it up at a surplus store? One of his teammates laughed behind him. This time the older man paused. His hand rose to touch the insignia. Not to show it, not to explain it. Just a very gentle touch, the way someone might touch an old photograph. In that instant, his eyes changed. They were no longer the eyes of a weary older man. They were the eyes of someone stepping back into a distant memory. Snow blanketed the hills in 1951, wind cutting through flesh, artillery tearing open the sky. A unit of 15 men, and then only one was left standing. But in the dining hall that day, no one knew that. Ryan did not see those memories. He saw only a silent older man sitting in front of him, and because he did not understand, he took another step forward. His hand closed around that thin, fragile arm. "All right, sir. Let's go have a talk with security." It was no longer a joke. It was the moment a boundary was crossed, when confidence turned into overreach, and in the room, holding its breath, something far greater was about to unfold. From behind the serving counter, where steam fogged the small glass window overlooking the dining hall, Private First Class Morales had seen everything. 19 years old, enlisted for less than a year, he still carried within him an almost naive belief that the Army was a place where honor stood above ego and respect never needed to be demanded. When Ryan placed his hand on the older man's arm, Morales felt a chill run down his spine, even though the kitchen behind him burned with heat from the ovens. He thought of his grandfather, an infantryman who had fought in the Korean War. The older man rarely spoke about combat. Only sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would stare into space for a long time, as if listening to sounds no one else could hear. Morales had once asked him, "Were you afraid?" His grandfather had only smiled. Not everything needs to be spoken. And now, before Morales stood another older man, silent in the same way. He knew he could not walk into the middle of the dining hall and challenge a Green Beret. At Fort Bragg, rank and reputation were invisible yet unshakable walls. One mistake could follow him for the rest of his career. But staying silent felt like betraying the very values he believed in. Morales wiped his hands on his apron, took a deep breath, and moved quickly into the back kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans masked the pounding of his heart. The wall-mounted phone in the corner looked ordinary, as it did every day. But today, it looked like a decision. Morales dialed the office of the command sergeant major. The line picked up. Calm voice. "CSM's office?" Morales swallowed. "Sir, there's a veteran in the dining hall. His name is Harold Walker. He's being given a hard time." Silence on the other end. Not indifference. Recognition. "Who did you say?" "Harold Walker, sir." A few more seconds of quiet, then another voice came on the line, deeper, heavier than steel. "Keep him there. We're on our way." The call ended. Morales slowly placed the receiver back down. His palms were damp with sweat. Out in the dining hall, Ryan still had his hand wrapped around the older man's arm, but somewhere else on the base, a door had just swung open, and something no one in that dining hall could imagine had begun moving toward them. Ryan's hand was still wrapped around the older man's thin arm, not tight, but firm enough to assert control. "All right, sir, let's go." There was no trace of humor left in his voice. It had entirely shifted into a tone of command. The dining hall was so silent that the steady hum of the ventilation system overhead could be heard clearly. Eyes were no longer turning away. Every gaze was fixed on them. The older man, Harold Walker, calmly set his spoon down on his tray. The movement was slow, deliberate, without a tremor. He did not rise because he was being pulled. He rose as though he had decided himself that it was time. That composure made the situation even stranger. Ryan felt it, but he had gone too far to retreat. His pride and the weight of every eye in the room would not allow him to take a single step back. And then, at that exact moment, the large doors of the dining hall burst open. The sound echoed sharply enough that several heads snapped toward the entrance. Command Sergeant Major Kane entered first. His face revealed nothing but his cold, sharp eyes swept across the room in a single second. Behind him was the base commander, and behind them, a presence that seemed to freeze the very air. Impeccable uniform, 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders. His stride unhurried, yet commanding beyond question. General Matthew Whitaker. Chairs scraped back instantly. The sound of boots snapping to attention rang out in unison. The entire dining hall straightened like a single rising wave. Only Ryan remained motionless, his hand not yet fully withdrawn from the older man's arm. In that instant, every thought in his mind tangled into confusion. There was no reasonable explanation for a 4-star general to appear in the middle of lunch hour because of an older man. General Whitaker did not look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed on the hand gripping Harold Walker's arm. Just one look. Ryan released him immediately, as if he had touched heated steel. The general stepped forward and stopped before the older man. He stood tall, heels together, and before hundreds of soldiers. He raised his hand in salute. A precise, unwavering salute. Sergeant Walker, it is an honor to meet you. The entire room stopped breathing. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. In a brief moment, yet long enough to change everything, what he thought he had been controlling had never belonged to him at all. After that solemn salute, the entire room seemed to turn to stone. No one remembered their trays. No one dared to breathe too loudly. General Whitaker lowered his hand, but the rare respect in his eyes remained. A respect not given to rank, but to history. He turned to face the entire dining hall. You wear symbols on your shoulders that many men bled to build, he said, his voice steady yet carrying across the room. But not all of you know whose shoulders you're standing on. Then he looked toward Harold Walker. 1951. Hill 937. A 15-man Ranger unit was deployed deep behind enemy lines, surrounded. The room fell even quieter. 14 men were killed in less than 2 hours. Ryan felt his heart pound so hard it tightened his chest. 1 man remained alive. The general paused for several seconds, not for dramatic effect, but out of respect for the names no longer present to tell their own story. Sergeant Harold Walker did not merely survive. He broke through enemy encirclement in freezing conditions, carrying intelligence on opposing artillery positions, intelligence that saved more than 300 American soldiers. A faint intake of breath sounded somewhere in the room. For that action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The old insignia on Hal's lapel no longer seemed small. It felt heavy, not because of metal, but because of memory. General Whitaker stepped closer. That insignia is not a souvenir, he said, his voice lowered. It was placed on him by his team leader, moments before that man died in his arms. The space seemed to contract. Ryan remembered the words he had spoken only minutes earlier. Pick it up at a surplus store? Now those words echoed in his mind like a bitter refrain. The older man's expression did not change. No pride, no anger. He simply stood there, a a man who had survived not to be celebrated, but to remember. And in a room filled with modern tabs, bright badges, polished insignia, one small pin had caused them all to bow their heads. Ryan no longer saw a 92-year-old man. He saw part of the very foundation on which he himself stood. The entire room was still suspended in shock. But what truly silenced them was not the medal, not the 300 lives saved, not even the title, Medal of Honor. It was what happened next. Command Sergeant Major Kane stepped forward. His eyes settled on Ryan, not loud with anger, but cold and deep, like a verdict already written. "Staff Sergeant Caldwell," he said slowly, "you will report immediately after this hour." Nothing more needed to be said. Everyone understood. Ryan stood straight. But for the first time since walking into the dining hall, he did not feel tall. And then, a rough yet steady voice broke the silence. "Jim, that's enough." Harold Walker looked at the four-star general, calling him by his first name like an old friend. "He's just young." The words were not loud, but they caused the entire room to hold its breath once more. "We were like that too," Hal continued, his gaze free of accusation. "Full of fire, certain we understood everything." Ryan lifted his head. His eyes met the eyes of the man he had just humiliated. There was no contempt in them, no revenge, only a deep weariness and a strange, quiet compassion. In Hal's mind, the image returned, a snow-covered trench. His team leader is lying in his arms, breath breaking apart. "Make it home. Tell them we tried." That small insignia had been pressed into his hand in those final seconds, not as a reward, but as a message. Hal had carried it for more than 70 years, not so others would know, but so he would never forget. "Don't ruin his future," Hal said softly. "Let the Army teach him the lesson." Ryan felt his throat tighten. He had faced enemy fire. He had walked through hostile ground, but never had he felt so small. Not because of rank, not because of punishment, but because of forgiveness. Sometimes the greatest strength does not lie in punishment. It lies in the ability to forgive, even when you have every right not to. And in that moment, in the middle of a room filled with soldiers, Ryan understood that today's lesson did not come from the battlefield, but from a man who had survived to tell the story of those who no longer had a voice. The consequences came faster than Ryan expected. That very afternoon, he stood outside the command office, no longer the confident Special Forces soldier walking beneath admiring glances, but a serviceman confronting his own mistake. The disciplinary decision was delivered, suspended from team duties, brought before a review board, required to attend the Army Heritage and Lineage course, the history and traditions of the force he had once believed he fully understood. No one shouted. No harsh insults were thrown. There was only disappointment. And sometimes, disappointment weighs heavier than reprimand. The news spread across the base like a gust of wind, not because anyone wanted to shame Ryan, but because the story was too significant to be forgotten. A proud Green Beret, a Medal of Honor, a salute in the middle of the dining hall. In the days that followed, Ryan began to read, not to fulfill an obligation, but because, for the first time, he truly wanted to understand. He read about the 1st Ranger units, about men who jumped behind enemy lines with primitive equipment, about missions with no expectation of return. He read about Hill 937, about a name he had never truly paid attention to before, Harold Walker. Each page felt like a mirror placed before him, and he no longer saw the image of a strong soldier, but a man who had allowed confidence to cross the boundary of respect. But the most significant lesson did not come from the documents. It came weeks later. Late one afternoon, in a small park near Fayetteville, Ryan saw the older man sitting on a bench, slowly breaking bread into pieces for the seabirds. Ryan stood still for a long time. Part of him wanted to turn away, avoid those eyes, avoid that memory. But this time, he did not run. He stepped forward, stopping at a respectful distance. "Sir, I'm sorry." No justification, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Harold Walker looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave a slight nod. "Sit down, son." Ryan sat at the far end of the bench. The two of them looked out over the water. After a while, Hal spoke softly. "You've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion." It was not a speech, just a sentence, but it was enough to change a man. And in that quiet afternoon, for the first time in years, Ryan did not try to prove anything. He simply sat there and listened. The story of that afternoon did not end with an apology in the park. It spread across the base, not as a scandal, but as a reminder. A few weeks later, in the main auditorium at Fort Bragg, every soldier, from the newest recruit to senior officers, was assembled for a new training session. The name of the program was displayed prominently behind the podium. "Know the shoulders you stand on." Command Sergeant Major Kane stepped forward. He did not mention Ryan's name. He did not reference the incident. He simply told the story of a Ranger unit in 1951. 15 men went in, only 1 returned. When black and white photographs of the young soldiers from that era appeared on the large screen, the entire auditorium fell silent. Those faces were no different from the ones seated there today. Just as young, just as confident, just as certain they had their whole future ahead of them. Ryan sat in the middle row. He no longer felt the shame he had carried in the first days, felt gratitude, because he understood he had been stopped in time, before arrogance hardened into habit. After the session, many young soldiers quietly lingered to read the nameplates displayed along the exit, names they had never paid attention to before. Harold Walker's story was no longer a single event. It became part of the tradition, part of the collective memory. And more than anything, it became a silent question within each of them. Are we living in a way worthy of those who fell before us? A few days later, Ryan returned to the same park. Hal was sitting there again, as if the noisy world beyond had never existed. "The new training program. It's because of you," Ryan said softly. Hal smiled. "Not because of me," he replied. "Because of the ones who aren't here to tell their own story." The evening breeze moved gently across the surface of the lake. Ryan looked down at his hands, the hands that had once gripped the arm of a hero without knowing it. Now he understood something. Honor is not something you demand from others. It is something you learn to preserve. And sometimes the most significant lesson a soldier learns does not come from victory, but from humility before the past. Time passed, but that afternoon never disappeared from the memory of the base. It was no longer spoken of in whispers or excitement, but in quiet reflection. During recruit training sessions, when instructors spoke about tradition and honor, they did not tell the story as a shameful incident. They told it as a turning point. Because after that day, something had changed. In the dining hall, young soldiers began paying closer attention to worn caps and faded jackets. When veterans visited the base, they were no longer glanced at and dismissed. Soldiers stood. They saluted, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Ryan changed too. He returned to his team after his disciplinary period, but his return was not loud. There were no proud glances like before. He worked more, spoke less. During training, when younger soldiers bragged about accomplishments or joked about the old days, Ryan did not shout at them. He simply told a story about a 92-year-old man, about an old insignia, and about a salute in a dining hall that made an entire room snap to attention. He never said he was part of the story, but those who had been there knew. One afternoon, Ryan again sat beside Hal on the familiar park bench. "Do you ever feel," Ryan asked quietly, "that people remember the medal too much and forget the man you really are?" Hal gazed into the distance. "They may remember or forget the medal," he said slowly. "What matters is that they never forget why it exists." Ryan nodded. He understood that the Medal of Honor was not the peak of recognition. It was the price of loss. Then Hal added one more sentence, light as wind yet deep as memory. "Honor isn't something you wear on your shoulders for others to see. It's something you carry in your heart, even when no one is watching." Ryan remained silent. Perhaps the greatest lesson he had learned was not knowing who had sacrificed, but understanding that he was living because of that sacrifice. And from that day on, whenever he walked into the dining hall, he no longer searched for admiring eyes. He searched for opportunities to show respect. Some stories need no gunfire, no battlefield, yet they are powerful enough to shake a man to his core. That afternoon, on base, where confident laughter once filled the air, became a quiet turning point. Not because a four-star general walked in, not because a prestigious medal was mentioned, but because of something far simpler. A man chose to forgive. Harold Walker did not need to prove who he was. He did not stand there to be honored. He had come only to attend a memorial for the comrades who had fallen on a snow-covered hill so many years ago. The small insignia on his lapel was not a symbol of victory. It was a reminder of names no longer called. And perhaps what makes this story linger longest in people's hearts is not the Medal of Honor, but the moment a young Green Beret realized that true strength does not lie in making others fall silent, but in knowing when to bow your head. Each of us will one day walk into a room where we believe we are the strongest, the most knowledgeable, the most important. But remember this, the quietest person in that room may be the one who paid the highest price for the freedom you now enjoy. And sometimes, the greatest lesson of a lifetime is not how we fight, but how we listen. Honor does not rest on your shoulder. It lives in the way you treat those who cannot defend themselves. And humility is the mark of a mature warrior. If this story made you pause and reflect, leave a comment, perhaps just the name of someone silent you are grateful for. Share this video with someone you believe needs to hear today's story. And if you want to help us preserve these memories, these lessons, and the people who carry them, subscribe to join us at Deep Life Tales. Because out there, beneath the noise of the world, there are still heroes walking quietly among us, and their stories deserve to be told.